Finally, Hitler fell seriously ill with jaundice, which kept him bedridden for a fortnight. He could not make the daily situation conferences. He still looked quite weak when he resumed at these conferences in early October. Shortly afterwards, he dismissed the doctors who had treated him, Karl Brandt and Hans Karl von Hasselbach. He continued to trust only Professor Morell. In October, we heard of Rommel's death and of the circumstances of his forced suicide. That he had been given the choice of poison or a pistol. I did not want to think about it and pushed it from my mind. Much later, in Soviet captivity, I met Alfred Gauss, Rommel's former chief of the General Staff, who had been replaced later by Hans Speidel. Gauss had not understood why he had been replaced. He told me how he had tried to convince Rommel to stay clear of the plot. Gauss had noticed that plans for a coup were circulating. Rommel was involved insofar as feelers had been put out to see if he would be prepared to accept the post of Reich President in the event of a successful coup. Gauss confided that the best he had been able to come up with was to request leave to visit his wife for her birthday. Then he went not to his own wife, but to see Rommel's wife, Lucy. He had visited her out of consideration for her safety, and also to make her understand as clearly as possible that her husband was in great danger. He had almost pleaded, "Frau Rommel, save your husband. He must go to Hitler." His only way out of the trap was to report at the higher level that something was afoot. The field marshal did not actually need to go into details. "Your husband has access to the Führer at any time, but he just has to tip him off, and then he is free of the thing," Gauss recalled having attempted to convince Frau Rommel. Well, later Rommel could not be saved. I took an increasing interest in the course of the war, and weighed up whether I should take a chance and visit my native province of Silesia. I talked to Albert Bormann about having a couple of days' leave. We were standing in front of the Situation Conference barrack hut. The conference had just ended and Hitler was coming out. Bormann was carrying a signature blotting book, and I had some dispatches to deliver. Hitler saw that and came over to us directly. Bormann told him, "This young man wants to visit his home in Upper Silesia. What do you think of that? Can we let him?" "Yes, yes," Hitler said, nodded and added impishly. "But if you fall into Schörner's hands, even I will not be able to do anything for you. Then even my own signature will not be of any use to you." He probably meant that General Ferdinand Schörner would press-gang me into his ranks, as he needed every man he could lay hands on. Hitler had a very high opinion of the general, recently awarded the swords to his Knight's Cross with oak leaves, 14, and he was not the only one. After the war, a Russian said to me, "If Hitler had had a dozen Schörners, then you would have had a chance." In the end, I did not go to Silesia, my inquiry having originated basically from my curiosity to hear from Hitler how things really were on the Eastern Front. I would have liked to have brought some papers and photos to safety from there, but my Aunt Sophia did that later. She spent the end of the war not in Berlin, but with her mother at Alt-Schalkowitz. I never saw my grandmother Ottilie again. I discovered years later that she had died at the age of 87. Her last word to my aunt was sugar. I believed that this was because my grandmother always had a very sweet tooth. On 20th of November 1944, we left FHQ Wolfschanze forever. Hitler transferred his headquarters to the vicinity of Bad Nauheim, from where he would direct the impending Ardennes offensive. We had a short stay in Berlin before going on. I was shocked at the scene that greeted me. Since I had left the capital on 20th of July, it had received some devastating bombing raids. We took the special train to FHQ Adlerhorst, so named by Hitler at Ziegenberg. The opening days of the offensive from 16th December 1944 were very successful, but when the weather changed, the Allies regained air superiority and the offensive came to a standstill. I remember only constant military conferences and a coming and going of generals. My memory of it was overshadowed by what followed. At Ziegenberg it became certain we were heading for the end. In mid-February 1945, we finally returned from the Western Front to Berlin. The drive from Silesian Station, nowadays Berlin Ostbahnhof, to the Reich Chancellery was quiet. The capital had not expected us, and evidently people had other things to do. To the right and left of the streets, many of which were totally impassable, stood row upon row of houses reduced to skeletons, mere walls lacking a facade and roof timbering. During the journey, nobody said a word. Now all were gathered in the capital. We of the SS bodyguard, the female secretaries, doctors, adjutants, servants, and naturally House Administrator Kannenberg with all his staff. The intimate circle around Hitler had taken up its position. Reich Press Chief Otto Dietrich, the Bormann brothers, diplomat Howell. Keitel and Jodl went to their villas at Zehlendorf, while Goering had withdrawn to his country seat Karin-Hall near Berlin. An experience, which had nothing to do with the war, upset me greatly. It happened shortly after we arrived in Berlin. I had noticed previously at Ziegenberg that Karl Tanasek was acting strangely. We had a close friendship, and I had made several attempts to find out what was bothering him. "Something not right with you?" I asked him bluntly. "Debts? Something else eating you up?" No, everything's okay," he replied unconvincingly. I did not press the matter. Now in Berlin, he asked me to take over his shift one afternoon. He wanted to leave early. Tomorrow his leave began. I had no objection to double shifts. They were no problem for me, and I had a much longer off-duty period afterwards. Accordingly, I released Karl from duty as he wanted and asked, as usual, if there had been anything special to report. "Nothing new," he assured me, and handed me the register into which all telephone calls had to be entered. I wished him a good journey home, a nice holiday, and inquired after his wife, whom I knew to be pregnant. "Would you prefer a boy or a girl?" I asked him. "No idea." He shrugged his shoulders sadly. "It makes no difference." It made no sense to me. Why didn't he confide in me? Karl disappeared into his service room where our cleaner, Frau Herrmann, was at work. She told me later it had surprised her to see Karl putting on his best new uniform. He said no to her question asking if he were going out. Scarcely had she left the room when she heard a round fired. She ran back inside immediately. Karl had sat down on the bed and shot himself dead. The initial suspicion was that he might have got himself involved in some cloak and dagger activity. Obviously, we were all exposed to being recruited by foreign secret services. After some inquiries, the real reason soon came to light. The child that his wife was expecting was not Karl's. It could not be his. My friend had consulted Hitler's personal physician, Professor Morell, and a neurologist at Berchtesgaden. Both came to the same conclusion. Karl was sterile. He had not been able to handle the situation. The incident was rough on all of us in the bodyguard. His loss came as a great shock. After being apprised of the details, Hitler decided to treat the matter as an accident. When Hitler decided that a thing was an accident, then it must have been one. Every member of the SS bodyguard had 100,000 Reichsmarks life assurance, and this was what Karl's wife received. Bunker telephonist. At that time I became what the post-war world knows me as Hitler's bunker telephonist. Our commanding officer Franz Schadler, he had relieved Bruno Gesche in January, let me know that he had selected me for the switchboard in the now technically fully equipped deep bunker. Make yourself familiar with the installation and make sure everything works. I must have looked at him in surprise a little, for he added, "You have always done a good job, Mish." However, I was not really surprised. I was not really thinking anything at that moment. If I had asked why I had been selected for this undoubtedly responsible position, then he would have told me. I had been there already for years, had always taken an interest in my work, and taught it to a large number of people. Recently, I was the only one to attend a 2-week advanced telex training and scrambler course. That the new job was a special distinction for me, that I would be closer to Hitler in those days than any. In the first room right of the corridor, Chief Technician Johannes Henschel worked at his machinery and installations. These were all supplied with the necessary electricity. I had known Henschel for many years. He had been employed at the Reich Chancellery since 1933 and had a 4-room flat there. He had had an important role in the building of the Führerbunker and was now responsible for the technical installations in the machinery room. Hannes, as I called him, knew the whole technology inside out. In the machinery room near the door was an emergency diesel generator with various pumps, which among other things kept the dressing station below the Reich Chancellery supplied with fresh water from a deep spring bored for the purpose. 10 to 12 barrels of diesel oil were stacked near the air conditioning plant. This could run for about 1,000 hours and might also absorb battlefield gases sucked in. Once there was great alarm during a situation conference when a kind of acrid burning smell was noticed, and the installation had to be shut down immediately. It turned out that Göring's car had been parked below an air intake, and the car, which used wood for fuel, had produced gases and vapours sucked in by the intake. During the last days in the bunker, the exhaust gases of the machinery created a kind of gymnasium fug, so that it fairly stank below. Opposite the machinery room, on the left side, was the so-called wet room, a bathroom with toilets, and immediately adjoining Henschel's machinery room was my room, in which the telephone switchboard was installed. Instead of the fine telephone switchboard above, I now had this cell. I had not previously operated this kind of switchboard, which was now occupying the deep bunker. I saw at once that it had plug connections. I sighed. Gone was the time with the modern Siemens unit and its many colourful buttons. Now it was plug and drop flap again. The junction box on the wall was the size of a shoebox. No suspicion whose bright idea this pitiful fitment was. It might have been all right for a small boarding house, but not for the Führerbunker at the Reich Chancellery. Obviously nobody had thought that the underground telephone switchboard here might become the most important switching centre for reports. Calls rerouted from the main switchboard in the new Reich Chancellery to the Führerbunker. Telephone switchboard reached only 5 extensions. One telephone was in Hitler's private rooms, another in Professor Morell's room abutting the switchboard, and other extensions were with the valet Linger in his restroom and the guard. The 5th telephone was in the corridor. The room containing the telephone exchange was open to the whole floor, therefore without door, curtain, or other screening. Apart from the junction box, there was a telex machine, a scrambler, and 2 Celenta typewriters, extra quiet and used by Hitler's secretaries. Additionally, on the stool in front of the distributor box, there was another place to sit. Once down here, this room was the only contact with the outside world. One could no longer see or hear what was happening above, no matter what. As well as the telephone room, there were 4 others. The corridor to them could be closed by a door, but this mostly stood open. First one came into an anteroom with a table and 4 chairs on the left-hand side. From this anteroom it was possible to access another room, occupied by Dr. Morell and later Goebbels. To the right, the corridor went down to Linger's room and a rather larger surgery and dressing station, where the most important medical utensils, instruments and medication were kept. One reached Hitler's rooms from the 2nd floor. The first door on the left led immediately into a lobby. Linger held himself in readiness there for assignments. He also used it for writing and serving meals. From there, one went left into a room intended as Hitler's dressing room, but which was taken by Eva Braun. The lobby led into Hitler's study and living rooms. Even these rooms were only 3.5 by 3.2 meters in size. In the living room, a sofa and 3 chairs were squashed together. The big furniture pieces made the room look more cramped than it actually was. From this part of the suite, one turned right into Hitler's bedroom, with the bed in the far corner. There was a bell above the night table to summon Linger whenever he was needed, and near the bed was an oxygen bottle. The first time I was below with Gretz, I did not take a great deal of notice of Hitler's rooms. Everything looked very unreal to me. Later, after Hitler had moved in, I never went into his private rooms again. On the other side of the lobby, one crossed a small floor with a narrow clothing compartment into a wet room with toilet and shower, then reached Eva's room. Here, too, tortoise-shell lamps hung from the ceiling. Other person, that I had got myself a cosy number in the best protected place in Berlin, I had no time for such ideas. I was to man the bunker telephone switchboard. That was an order like any other. Therefore, I had to familiarize myself with it as quickly as possible. After Schädel had made me bunker telephonist, I rang Hermann Gretz at once, the Reichspost technician. He was ready to show me everything straight away. With him, I descended into the catacomb for the first time. Not far from my room on the ground floor of the adjutant's wing, we descended some red-carpeted steps into the cellars of the old Reich Chancellery. Gretz hurried past the staff kitchen, the festival hall cloakroom and the toilets, and indicated the door to a narrow corridor leading into the new Reich Chancellery. This narrow, endless tunnel was about 80 metres long, and we called it Kannenberg Alley after the house administrator. Its actual purpose was for bringing food from the supply rooms in the new Reich Chancellery to the dining hall in the old Reich Chancellery. We did not go along it on this occasion, although often enough in the future I would use it to reach the cellars of the new Reich Chancellery. Gretz took me back a little, and after leaving a gas-proof steel door behind us, we entered a sluice room equipped with two similar doors. Both were open. The door straight ahead led into the ministerial gardens. The Reichspost technician went through the other one, however, and stepped up the pace, which told me we still had far to go. Then we found ourselves in the antibunker before the deep bunker. This antibunker lay below the festival hall of the old Reich Chancellery. Because of the explosive force of British and American bombs, the sounding boards of the festival hall had been reinforced with concrete between 1943 and 1944, during building work on the deep bunker. The garden of the neighbouring foreign ministry could be reached through an emergency exit. The large cellar below the festival hall and the winter garden, only separated from the bunker walls by about 3 metres, led to the area in the west where the anti-bunker adjoined the deep bunker around a concrete block. The anti-bunker had its own 40 kW generator, which provided lighting and heating and also operated the water pumps and fresh air supply. Several WCs and washrooms were available there, as well as a kitchen with a pantry and storage room. There were also 2 more storage rooms, in one of which bed frames and mattresses were stacked. Shortly afterwards, the other storage room was filled to just under the ceiling with provisions. There were also restrooms. Later, one side of the corridor was the lived-in side, the other the unoccupied side. In all, not counting the central corridor and technical rooms, there were 16 small rooms in the antibunker, none larger than 4 by 4 metres. The first time I went down there with Gretz, I didn't take in all the detail. Hurriedly we cut through the antibunker by the narrow central corridor with its long wooden tables and never met a living soul. Everything swam before my eyes. It was a true labyrinth. At the end of the antibunker corridor were more heavy steel doors, which served as gas-proof sluices. In front of them, one of the SS bodyguard would do sentry duty, while sitting at a small table, the last guardian before the bridge into the subterranean abode and refuge of the Führer. Gretz led the way forward. Down a couple of steps, and finally we were in the deep bunker, Hitler's bunker suite. Construction work on the Führer bunker had begun far too late, and it was not ready, having not yet dried out. Because of the remaining damp in the ground and walls, it smelt stale. The main contractors, AG Hochtief AG, had to improvise. No time remained to air it properly, Gretz explained. Because the bunker was below the water table in a kind of concrete trough, groundwater had to be continuously pumped out. I looked around and screwed up my eyes, getting accustomed only slowly to the harsh lighting of the naked lamp bulbs, reflected off the naked white walls. How minute everything was, how sad, unready, unworthy. Standing in the corridor, the Reichspost technician explained to me the division of the rooms. They were no more than cells, as in the anti-bunker. The corridor was only about 15 metres long and divided into 2 halves by a concrete bulkhead with a door. On the left wall in the rear section were lockers with firefighting equipment. while on the opposite wall was a longish, narrow table with chairs. Right at the end was another bulkhead, behind which was the emergency exit into the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Additionally, a room had been allocated for the RSD, which had a rear area for the dogs at the back. Blondie the Elastian dog had had some pups. That Franklin Roosevelt was dead. Lorenz said that upon receiving the news, Hitler had jumped up, but then commented soberly, "A half-year too late." Nevertheless, he mentioned having had a presentiment about it. Goebbels seemed to find new hope in Roosevelt's death. Once again, the talk was of a turn in events. Of course, there was nothing at all in the days that followed which pointed to such a turn. I took ever less interest in my service instructions, which required me to eavesdrop telephone conversations infrequently to check the tone quality, and now I listened into everything. I was constantly on the watch for something new. It was all totally clear. The Western Allies were maintaining the military pressure relentlessly in order to obtain the unconditional surrender of Germany. Nothing suggested we might achieve a separate peace at the last minute. To the very end, Hitler could not understand why the British would not unite with him against Bolshevism. Since February, my work hours could not have been considered normal. They were adapted to Hitler's rhythms, in which night became day and day became night. The last situation conference seldom began before midnight and lasted into the early hours. The cellar and bunker rooms were filling noticeably. It seemed to me that all members of the state and party leadership were being given quarters here, in addition to their junior adjutants, who inhabited the catacombs in the new Reich Chancellery. The first rooms that one reached at the end of Kannenberg Allee were those of Luftwaffe Adjutant Nikolaus von Below, Otto Günscher, and General Wilhelm Burgdorf. In this stretch were also to be found the domains of Martin Bormann and his co-workers, the half-brothers Wilhelm Zander and Alvin Broder Albrecht. Much further on were the rooms of the female secretaries, Gerda Christian, Christa Schröder, Traudl Junger, and Johanna Wolf. These were adjacent to the offices of Himmler's liaison officer Hermann Fegelein, General Hans Krebs, and Major Bernd Freitag von Loringhoven. Finally, rooms had been allotted to Vice Admiral Hans-Erich Voss, diplomat Walter Höwel, and Hitler's pilots Hans Bauer and Georg Betz. The remaining rooms were for the house staff. Right at the end of this cellar, behind the officers' mess and the garages, were the living quarters for the staff of the motor pool and the office of Hitler's driver Erich Kempka. In one of the large cellar rooms with access to Vossstrasse, an emergency hospital had been set up. Many civilians sought treatment there. The dressing station was quickly filled to overflowing. I only came to this part of the catacombs once, and briefly. So there we sat, like the German people. In cellars, and above us the land lay in ruins. The bright glare nipped in the bud any hint of snugness which the furniture introduced from the Führer suite should have provided. It made everything look only more repulsive. From the central corridor, the second door left led into the map room in which, in the final weeks, military situation conferences were held despite its tightness. The room was hardly larger than the others, maybe 4 by 3.6 meters. In the middle was a large table, and narrow benches were fitted along the walls. If the overall situation was being discussed, so many people entered that the participants had to stand to deliver their reports to Hitler, who would be seated. Often the table would be carried out into the central corridor, and the situation conference continued there. After the first tour with Gretz, I was greatly relieved to step out into the garden through the emergency exit. Strewn around were all kinds of equipment, including shovels and spades, stuck in the ground. The bunker was still being worked on, an observation tower at its centre. Then I looked up at the clouds. Fresh air, daylight. I began to sense what it meant to have to endure this over a long period of time, and I also realized that for me such a time was dawning. At first, the bunker was uninhabited. Not even Hitler lived there. Until a direct hit by a heavy bomb made it impossible, he ate and slept in his flat on the first floor of the old Chancellery. When the air raid warning went off, Hitler would not go down into the deep bunker, but only to the air raid shelter, and even then he would leave the shelter as soon as they gave the all clear. Often, when there was a warning, he would go to the upper rooms for a better picture of the attack, as he would say. Once he even took my colleague Joseph Yoshi Graf into the open air during an air raid. Poor Yoshi was appalled and tried desperately to make Hitler seek shelter. "Ach was, nothing can happen to me," was his stock reply. Even in the heart of the inferno, always the same old reply. Yoshi pointed to the rain of flak splinters falling over the Reich Chancellery, but it made no impression on Hitler. We would wait in suspense for the incoming reports on the military situation, but increasingly without any great hope. On 11th of March, Hitler made a surprise visit to 9th Army HQ at Searo, between Frankfurt on the Oder and Berlin. It was his last visit to the troops at the front. The daily situation conferences would now begin towards 3 in the afternoon. They were usually held in Hitler's study in the new Chancellery, the conference room in the old Chancellery having been badly damaged in air raids. The first conference of the day would last 2 or 3 hours. Towards midnight or 1, Hitler would hold a night situation conference. Hitler was constantly preparing new strategies to turn the tide at the last hour. Nobody within the bodyguard believed in such a miracle any longer. It was just a question of how defeat would come about, what fate was in store for us, the vanquished, and especially those of us in Hitler's closest circle. Around mid-March, Eva Braun arrived at the Reich Chancellery. She stayed only a short while, but then resurfaced a second time to everybody's surprise a few days later. It appeared that nobody had been informed, Hitler included. He was anything but delighted when she turned up again, and he did everything he could to convince her to return to Munich. Everybody else prevailed upon to go did so, but all his efforts here were in vain. Eva Braun made it clear to him that her place was at his side, and nobody would make her change her mind. She seemed absolutely determined on the matter. My colleagues sighed, but I was really quite pleased she was there. Her almost perpetual cheerful mood would do much to brighten up the gloomy atmosphere. All the same, I did wonder about her decision. It had not been long, perhaps a month ago, when she had first arrived, and I had been instructed to take her with all her baggage back to the station. "Ach, what would I do in Berlin anyway?" she had said. "There are only bomb craters here." Soon after her second appearance, she came to me in the lobby and handed me her watch. "Ach, please, it doesn't work." "I'll have it seen to," I promised. She handed it to me, a small watch of white gold, the face enclosed by diamonds. I took it to a jeweller in the Friedrichstrasse and collected it the next afternoon. The jeweller Wiese was still going, and so now was Eva's watch. I had a servant take it to her, and I was happy to have been of small service to her. On the night of 12th of April 1945, after the late situation conference, I met Press Secretary Heinz Lorenz. He was very excited and brandished a telex in front of my nose. After he came back from seeing the Führer, he told me, sometime in mid-April, bunker life began. Hitler descended into the place where he would die. Eva never left his side and lived from then on in his dressing room. All situation conferences were now held in the Führer bunker map room, and the bunker telephone switchboard had to be manned around the clock. Our SS bodyguard commander Schädel came up to me. I already suspected what he was going to say. "Misch, you are going down there with them." Reluctantly, I made my way with my sleeping mat into the new subterranean kingdom. On the way down into the Führer bunker, every step reinforced my bad feelings about the move. I was never claustrophobic, but since those days down there I understand the fear of confined spaces. While most of the steel doors were open most of the time, the last door down into the Führer bunker itself was always kept shut. In front of this last door, one of the bodyguard, occasionally with an RSD colleague, would be seated at a small table. The RSD were principally responsible for guarding the second exit, the emergency way out. As I unrolled my sleeping mat for the first time in my new workplace deep underground, it occurred to me that we were now finally buried alive. I had my telephone lines, however. Now, in the truest sense of the word, I was going to be on the phony all day. It was my only contact with life outside the bunker. I was surrounded by cold, damp, glaring white artificial light. To know that Hitler had to live and suffer under the same conditions was of little comfort. Or should I say, gave me no comfort. Now it was no longer the time to think of others, not even the Führer. One had one's own problems to attend to. Whenever possible, I would go up to my old service room to sleep. Only when there was nothing else for it did I lay out the mat in the bunker. Usually I would be too dog-tired to notice whether my bed was really comfortable or not. In a cellar room, directly under the entrance for vehicles, a dining hall had been set up. The kitchen staff had a big field kitchen in which they cooked tasty dishes for all the Reich Chancellery staff and the military hospital. Hot food was available all day. One could fetch it at any time. Only occasionally did I join the female secretaries to eat at the long wooden table in the corridor of the ante-bunker. Every day I could have eaten there the meals prepared in the small corner kitchen of Frau Manciali, Frau von Exner's successor. But that kind of diet food was not really my thing. I had no scheduled mealtime. When I wanted my lunch break, I would call my deputy Retzbach at the new Reich Chancellery switchboard, who would then come down. He did not like to be my number two. No wonder. There was a gloomy, depressed mood everywhere, to be sure. But in the deep bunker it was worse. One could see the same thoughts in the eyes of everybody who had to come down to this funeral vault. In it I lodged. Because of where my workplace was situated, I could see whoever entered or left the Führer bunker, all the comings and goings. From now on, everybody who wanted to see Hitler had to come past my telephone switchboard. Beyond the situation conferences, there were only short audiences. None lasted more than 20 minutes. Everybody wanted to get out of the bunker as quickly as possible. Even Monke, my former company commander who had driven me to the Reich Chancellery on my first day there 5 years ago, could not find the time to exchange a few words with me after seeing Hitler. Adolf Hitler, Eva Braun, Valet Heinz Linger, Professor Theodor Morel, Maintenance-Technician Johannes Hentschel and I, we were the inhabitants of the Führer bunker. It was Hitler's last birthday, his 56th. To congratulate him, Reich youth leader Arthur Axmann had some young, highly decorated SS soldiers and about 20 Hitler Youth parade in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. I only heard about it but saw nothing of it. I never went up the whole day. I sat at my switchboard and just could not get away from telephone calls bringing birthday wishes. Henschel's diesel engine and my head throbbed in competition. The ventilation system ran incessantly. After a reception at the new Reich Chancellery in which, among others, Goebbels, Goering, Himmler, the Bormann brothers, Speer, Ribbentrop and some generals, such as Wilhelm Burgdorf and Hans Krebs took part, Hitler came down to the bunker and held a situation conference in the map room. There was no trace of any festive spirit. The birthday was finished with. The only word to describe the military situation was catastrophic. Days before, the 300,000 men of Army Group B had surrendered in the Ruhr pocket. Their commander, Field Marshal Walter Model, shot himself shortly afterwards. The British and Americans were at the Elbe, while the Soviets were close to the gates of the Reich capital. For the imminent division of Germany into a northern and a southern part, Hitler had ordered Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, to take command of the northern sector, and the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, to take over the south. The final order was resistance to the last man. A small assortment of Wehrmacht soldiers and Waffen-SS, Volkssturm pensioners and Hitler Youth against millions of Red Army men. What could be hoped for? I heard the participants at the situation conference urging Hitler to direct the final struggle from Obersalzberg and leave the bunker while there was still time to get out of Berlin. Until then, I had been counting on our going to Berchtesgaden, but Hitler would not be moved. He wanted to remain. Now I had to do some rethinking. I did not succeed. What would it mean for me? All I wanted was what most of the others wanted. You could see it in their eyes. They all wanted to get out of here, out of the bunker, out of Berlin. Goering in his effeminate uniform looked very nervous all day. Apparently, he was worried that he might not be able to get away in time. Finally, he took his leave of Hitler under the pretext that important tasks would be awaiting him in southern Germany. Hitler let him go without raising any objections or passing a remark. He seemed to look upon this sauve-qui-peut mood as if he were a disinterested spectator. I was hoping that perhaps there might be somebody who could change his decision. My mind was racing while telephone calls interrupted from time to time. Until this day, Hitler's birthday, on which under code word Clausewitz the state of alert had been added as preliminary stage to the declaration of a state of emergency, I had always gone home to see my wife and daughter after duty. During this state of alert, that was no longer possible. On my advice, Gerda had taken Gitta to her parents' house at Rudau from our marital flat into which she had moved back. I strained every brain cell trying to think of some way to get my family to safety, away from the Russians. In the bunker, the export model version of the Volksempfänger radio set was to be found everywhere. Goebbels was speaking through it. I did not listen to what he was saying. If he had known that at home I regularly listened to BBC London. Da 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 da. In the evening, Eva gathered the remaining guests of the birthday reception upstairs in the Führer suite. The bunker was almost empty. Only I remained at my work post, and Hitler in his room. The last celebration in the Reich Chancellery took place without the Reich Chancellor. During the morning, the Reich Chancellery came under heavy artillery fire. In the deep bunker, one heard nothing. Only when a shell came down near the garden exit did the walls tremble for a second or so. On this day, I saw Hitler only briefly on a few occasions. Linger had awoken him to report about the shelling. The boss could still not credit it that the Russians were at the gates. Over the last few months, he had grown increasingly distrustful of his entourage, and now, shortly before the defeat, this distrust reached its zenith. Behind every contradiction he detected treachery. Everywhere he suspected disinformation. He was fidgety, nervous, and looked depressed. My colleagues and I knew that the fall of Berlin to the Red Army was only a matter of a few days. The Soviets had already fought through to the suburbs, and Bernau, about 15 kilometers from Berlin, had fallen. Frenzied activity and total apathy alternated. Among ourselves, we spoke openly of our hope that Hitler still might decide to leave Berlin, giving us the chance at the last moment to escape being trapped in the bunker. Only Goebbels kept pouring out his fantastic final victory scenarios. I noticed how he kept on at Hitler constantly as if trying to inebriate him one last time using all the tricks of the propaganda trade, something of which even the Führer himself now seemed to be in dire need. It no longer cut any ice with us. The last months had not passed Hitler by without leaving their mark. Every defeat, every setback, every act of treason, real or imagined, from within his closest circle contributed to his clearly recognizable physical decay. Now his gait was sluggish, and he dragged a leg. The eyes often seemed to have no fixed point, while his sense of balance seemed disturbed. Above all, in his every movement he had slowed, and all in all he looked to me like an old man. His left hand trembled distinctly, something I had not noticed before, and though he did not fumble when accepting dispatches, now he always used his right hand. Just as in better times, when he attempted to hide his need for reading glasses, in this case too he tried to conceal the visible signs of weakness by keeping the trembling hand out of sight as much as possible. As for his physical and mental state, he continued to make a good show of it. Even we, those closest to him, could only assess his general level of morale and mood from the reactions and expressions of the other participants at the situation conferences. It was very rare that we noted anything. He wanted to keep up this discipline which he showed by day, but the rapidly increasing physical burden made it visibly ever more difficult. Morel was no longer able to control the wear and tear and was released after 9 years' service. He trudged past me, carrying his packed bags and breathing heavily, on the evening of 21st April. Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, one of Hitler's travelling physicians, took over his care. My concern for my wife and daughter grew unceasingly. For some time, much of the population of Berlin had taken up residence in the overflowing bunkers. Formerly, I had always been able to ring Gerda at her parents' house. Our private early warning system continued to function there. Some time beforehand, telephone technician Gretz had had some lines laid in the neighbouring houses. When I warned my wife of an alarm, she pressed a button and the neighbouring families knew of an imminent air raid and reacted at once. That was a great advantage in the competition for a place in the bunker. In this way, most still had enough time to reach the bunker before the deadly bombs rained down. On this 21st April, my attempts to telephone Gerda met with failure. I kept trying until midnight. Around the corner, I could hear the sentry at the garden exit snoring. I discovered that something was wrong with the distributor box in the Berlin-Brits telephone exchange, through which calls went to Rudow and Buckow. Gerda's line remained intact, but I could not dial it. I had an idea. I rang a colleague I knew well in the Reichspost distributor exchange in Munich. From Munich, one could use a broadband cable to Berlin. This cable could handle 280 conversations at the same time. "Can you ring a number for me in Berlin?" I asked. At that moment, a female telephone operator who handled trunk calls switched into our conversation. "That is no problem. I can connect you at once if you like." I gave the lady the number, and less than a minute later I heard Gerda's voice. She had not slept and was crying softly. The date that for me marks the end of the Third Reich was 22nd April 1945. It was 8 days before Hitler's death, and some time before the unconditional surrender. The German Wehrmacht capitulated on 8 May 1945, but on 22nd April, a Sunday, Hitler capitulated. This day scarred itself into my memory no less than the day in which Hitler took his own life. Like all days since we began our bunker existence, 23rd April 1945 had no beginning. At some time or other, the long sleepless night ended in morning. I had nodded off again and was trying to keep myself awake with cognac and chocolate. The situation was more hopeless with every passing minute. To the north of Berlin, Soviet troops had advanced to Pankow and the front line already ran along Gesundbrunnen and Bernauer Straße. To the east of the city, the Red Army had reached Karlshorst and Friedrichsfelde and had penetrated the inner defensive ring. Hitler's hoped-for breach between the Western powers and the Russians had not come about, and neither had the attack by General Felix Steiner. Around midday, preparations were made for the situation conference. Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, Bergdorf and Bormann were already in the Führerbunker. The commanders-in-chief, who had removed themselves from Berlin, were represented by their adjutants,